the sequence of play is what's going to bring all of these concepts and bits of pieces together into a game. So what I want to do is compare the two sequences of play and then go through a couple of turns of a grand battle scenario and sort of see how they stack up against each other. Here's the sequence of play for the premier rules, presented with the martial typical flair. You can see a single turn is represented here. It's divided into two halves. The French, then whoever they're opposing, or whomever is allied with the French. And each side of the turn is basically identical to the other. We might think of this as a I go, you go kind of system. And it starts with the command phase, which is the declaration of your timed movement allowances. It's also where morale levels are determined. And even though it's presented here in both halves, it's really kind of a joint phase. Sort of establish that between the two, because there's really no activity on the board that's taking place. Next, we have the French cavalry charge phase. Now this includes cavalry movement. The opponent can respond. Infantry can form square, or opposing cavalry can reaction charge. Once that's completed, that stops. There's no further activity. We move on to the movement phase. This is where the timed movement comes in. The French player, within the time limitation, is permitted to move all of his forces. When that's completed, either forces moved or time expired, we move to the defensive fire phase. So the opponent can now fire at all units within range, adjacent, and then when that's concluded, the French can fire offensively at full range, any units he chooses. When that's completed, he proceeds to the assault, infantry assault. I know it's one phase, but it's really kind of two. I mean, we still have these cavalry charged up here that are waiting to melee. So the infantry performs their assaults. Once that's finished, then we have melees that can occur. So we'd have cavalry melees, infantry melees. It's actually not, quite in that order. You assault and melee, or you can resolve your cavalry melees. But once that's finished, then you proceed to morale recovery, which is rallying disorder or plus cron disorder units, retreating plus cron disorder units, and then recovering any cavalry readiness. And once that's completed, now flips over to the opponent. And they complete the exact same phases in the same order. The French is now the reactive player who can, opportunity charge or fire or reaction in whatever they need to do. The French conduct defensive fire. And then when the morale recovery phase is complete for the enemies, we now have the end of turn where we advance the turn marker to the next turn, and play continues. Continue each turn until the end of the scenario, or there's some wonderful outcome that causes it to finish. So as I said, it is basically I go, you go, but there is plenty of interactivity. It's not as if you can go grab a sandwich while your opponent is playing, because you'll miss your opportunities to charge or fire while your enemy is moving. And then, of course, you are responsible for the defensive fire aspect of your opponent's turn as well. So there's plenty to do for each player while you're playing. This is the 5th edition sequence of play. I had to dig this out of the Ligny box because it's the only representation I have of it, really. And you can see it's kind of similar. Now it just shows one sequence here, but it has a command segment, maneuver, combat, reorganization, finishing with turn adjustment. But that's kind of misleading. It makes it look like it's some kind of linear progression when really it's not. It's kind of filled with some twists and turns. So I'm going to present something else to try to break that down a little bit. So I made this little aid, which I'm going to destroy as soon as I'm done with this. And what I'm trying to show is how there is a lot of activity going on within this sequential sequence of play here. So when I look at the command phase as it's shown here on the chart, it's really sort of a joint phase between both players at the start of the turn. We determine command points, we each individually determine our in and out of command through command tracing, then we use our command points to create maneuver units and, complete our command aspect. That's done simultaneously by both sides. Then we proceed to the maneuver phase. This is where we toss all our chits in the cup and we start to randomly draw chits. So every time we draw a chit, it's going to be one of two things, an action chit or a maneuver unit chit. When we draw the action chit, both players will simultaneously perform that action, basically, without stepping on each other's toes. When that's complete, we toss it aside and we go back and we draw another chit. If we draw an MU chit, this is going to be one or the other players is now becoming active. We know that when we draw one MU chit, all of our MUs are now essentially able to be active and move. But it's actually a little kind of a microcosm of a turn that we saw on the Premier side, because we do the charge for the player that drew the MU. He can now perform charge, and the cavalry melee actually is done right here. Then we go to a timed movement. I was a little confused about this a while back in an earlier presentation, but it actually says in the 5th edition, when you get to this point, you have 10 minutes to move your forces, your MUs. And I'm sure that's the same idea as the Premier, where it means really 10 minutes per MU, I suppose. So if you had 5 players and 5 MUs, they would be happening simultaneously. Once that movement is completed, now the opponent conducts defensive fire. And I should, obviously, during charge, the opponent is going to form square, reaction charge, those kind of things. The same kind of reactions occur, as well as during time movement, we have opportunity charges and fires. But then we get to the fire phases, defensive by the opponent, then offensive by the active player, then the assault melee, then reorganization for the active player. That means they can rally. They will perform their plus grand disorder retreats and recover any cavalry readiness. And then, when we're done with that, we loop back up and we draw another chit. And we continue that until the draw cup is empty. And then we come to the final turn adjustment, where we check morale levels and move to our next turn, at which point we just continue on and start again with command phase and so on. This is another play aid that another La Bataille player created, a flow chart, basically depicting just what I described. And it makes it seem really complicated, doesn't it? I mean, anytime you need a flow chart, you must think you're in trouble. But actually, it's just sort of laying out what I described in a little more logical manner. And once you sort of learn these paths, it becomes second nature. But the basic flow, once you've drawn an MU, is more or less the same as it is in the Premier. It's just that it's more random. You have this concept of initiative that you're gaining through your command system, and the randomization of the draws means you don't know who will move first in any particular turn. So we've been looking at Lutzen maps and play pieces. So obviously that means we're going to play some Lutzen to put these rules to the test. Now, the reason I like to use this one is that it presents a really interesting situation to both rule sets. I think it'll help to compare them pretty effectively, and I think we'll see some things play out. Now, Lutzen isn't a giant game. It's a decent-sized map. We'll be looking north here. So for the most part, the Allies will be coming from the south, attacking the French in the north. And the reason I'm going to go with this particular title, not just because I like it, but it presents the French in a very sort of spread out fashion at the beginning of the game, which is going to put each of the systems, I think, to an interesting test. What's the best way to set up and then proceed to, fight your forces, given the differences in command control, sequence of play, and so on. So we'll see the French kind of spread out amongst some towns and completely lacking in superior leadership. And I hope we'll see how that affects the game using both rule systems. So we'll get the side set up and get our first turn going.